Welcome to another Hero Forge painting guide, and today we are going to be doing something a little bit unusual. We're going to paint a miniature using only two colors. I'm sure you're asking why right now, and there's a couple different answers to that question. First of all, let's say you just want to paint a black and white miniature, something very stylized, or make it look like an old-timey movie. That's one reason. And the other reason comes to color selection when it comes to highlighting and shading a miniature. Now, of course, we highlight and shade to add contrast to our miniature, but I've taught many a new painter, and sometimes adding different colors can get a bit confusing. What color do I add to another color to highlight it? So if we eliminate the color factor, we could concentrate solely on our contrast and also on our layering. So for our Noir Detective here, we're going to start with his suit, which I pictured in my head as a dark navy suit. Because we primed in black, that takes care of some of the shade for our very dark colored suit. Now I'm putting on a very dark gray. This is our secondary shade layer. You saw what I mixed up on the palette there. Basically just black with a very small amount of white added. And this goes everywhere except for in the deepest recesses of the suit. For our next color, our base coat, you can see I'm just adding a very teeny tiny amount of white. I'm leaving the previous color on the left there so you can see the color difference. As you can see, it's very small. We don't need to do a lot here. We want to build up very slow layers because we have a fairly flat surface on our suit. We don't need to do any dramatic color shifts at this moment. Since this is our base coat, this is the majority color on the miniature. Virtually everything is a base coat, and all the colors work off of that base coat. So the shade shades the base coat, the highlights highlight the base coat. Majority of the model should be covered with the base coat, and that should be visible in the end. With the base coat down, we can start working on our highlights. And once again, just a very small amount of white is needed here because it's such an extreme color compared to our black. And also we are adding water to the palette as we get higher in the highlights. At this point, we need to have the paint a little bit on the thinner side. Thinner paint means more layers, less brush strokes. With our first highlight layer, we can start concentrating on those areas that are most prominent on the suit. We can see the blazer, how it flares out at the bottom. We want to highlight that area. We want to highlight the lapels. We have the crease going down the pants, and any other area that kind of sticks out where light would catch, that's going to add our contrast to our miniature. And always remember, we are applying thin layers and multiple layers where needed. Don't expect to get everything done with just one brush stroke. We want to apply it over and over until we get a nice smooth coverage. We shouldn't have any brush strokes if our paint is thin enough. Because we are painting a dark suit, we don't want to go overboard on our highlights. We're just going to do one highlight and then one edge highlight. Now, because this is an edge highlight and we want to highlight, well, the edges, we want this highlight to be a little bit more ramped up than the previous one. So we're adding just a little bit more white because we want a nice crisp edge. So you can see here, just applying it on the edges of our suit, maybe the bottom area, the cuff of the pants. We want to be very minimal with this color. Not every single edge is getting covered, just the ones in the highlight regions. Next, we are going to paint the trench coat, and I'm picturing that as a kind of traditional khaki colored trench coat. So we want a much lighter mixture here, and we are actually going to this time start with the base coat and not the shade layer. Now I'm going to throw a curveball at you. While in painting you often hear about contrast, push the contrast. That is true. We do want contrast to bring miniatures alive, but there are an often lot of situations where you actually don't want a whole lot of contrast, and here's one. Because our trench coat is fairly flat, it doesn't have any billowing folds in it, there's not a whole lot of areas to shade. So what do we do instead? Well, we don't have to shade it as much then. That's the reason why here we can start with the base coat, and instead of starting with a dark shade color and then covering up 98% of the miniature with our base color, instead, we're going to put the base color down and then go back with a thinned black paint wash and just put that along the recesses. This is going to save us a huge amount of time painting this miniature. All we have to do is base coat, then put the shade down with a wash, and if your wash is a little bit messy here and there, that's perfectly fine. We can just clean it up by reapplying the base coat where necessary. This works very well when you're painting fairly flat areas that don't have a huge amount of folds and that therefore don't require a huge amount of shading. When mixing up our highlights, once again, we just have to add a little bit of white thanks to only using 2 colors in this project. Also, I do want to mention this isn't an automatic process. We tweak the paint ratios depending on our needs, so I'm not just simply mixing the same amount of white in each time. I'm checking them on the miniatures, adding a little bit of white. Oh wait, maybe that was too much. Let's add a little bit more black. Do we have the paint thin enough? Let's add a little bit of water. All these little adjustments you have to make until you get the right paint to water ratio for your style of painting and how fast you want to paint. Now, because we have this trench coat, which is a big flat area, we really need to take our time here so we don't get brush strokes showing up. That means very, very thin paint and very slowly building up those layers. Now, when you first begin, those first few layers, it may look a little bit sloppy. You can see here, we can see the brush strokes as we paint, but as we add the additional very transparent layers, that's all gonna smooth out, and eventually we'll get a nice very smooth surface as long as we take our time and the paint is thin enough. Another highlight, the process continues, and I am taking my time on this one, once again, because of the very smooth nature of our trench coat. Don't always be locked into X number of highlights. Usually a good frame of reference is 2 shades, 1 base coat, 3 to 4 highlights, but you need to adjust that depending on what you're painting. And since what I'm painting here is very smooth, I'm taking my time with the highlights, just mixing in very microscopic amounts of white, because as long as you have the time to spend, go ahead, add a few extra transparent layers. It'll pay off in the end. Our final regular highlight, once again, just adding more white, and you can see how very thin that paint is. Thinner the paint, less likely those brush strokes are going to show up, and we just repeat the process, this time on a smaller area, working our way up towards those final highlights. One of the main complaints about highlighting with this layering method that I hear is that it takes a long time, and I have to disagree with that. The first couple layers takes a long time, but you can see how fast it becomes as we start painting those smaller and smaller areas, start working our way into those upper highlights. This coat right here probably took literally 1 minute to finish. So while the first one may have taken 8 or 9, we shorten the time because we are painting less and less area each time. Once again, final thing to take care of is the edge highlighting. So this color we can go a little bit more light with, add a little bit more white. Also, you may want to go a little bit thicker depending on what your previous mixture was. We want more control over this because we want to just add it on those very crisp edges. So thicker, slightly thicker paint gives us more control, so we can very delicately really pick out those fine details, those fine edges on the model. The last thing to paint is his skin, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, but at least at this point, you know what the recipe is. Starting to run into a little bit of a problem here. Because we are only using 2 colors, therefore just shades of gray, it's hard to come up with a skin color that's not going to look the exact same shade as our suit or our trench coat. There is also the added problem of trying to make a realistic skin tone using just 2 colors and not make them look like a ghost. But even here, once again, the adage proves out. Sometimes less is more. We don't necessarily want to add an extreme amount of contrast when painting certain items, especially when it comes to faces, fairly smooth faces. There's a little bit of shadow underneath one's cheeks, underneath the chin. However, that doesn't mean that that should be a straight black, and the highlights on the cheekbones, on the nose, on the top of the chin should be pure white. That would just look very, very weird. So just remember, contrast is good, but it's good when it's properly applied. And also remember, sometimes you do need to break the rules. For example, gentleman here is wearing a very wide brim hat, therefore his face should all be in shadow. But if we didn't highlight the face, it would just look very odd, like we forgot to paint it. So sometimes you need to break the rules a little bit just to add a little bit more natural realism to the miniature, and sometimes forgo what logic would tell you. Now, I know some of this might be contradiction. Contrast is good, always pump up the contrast on your miniatures, but sometimes don't do it. You want to highlight what you can see from above, but sometimes don't do it. And that's kind of the nature of painting. Sometimes you have to break the rules, sometimes even ignore what I say, and do whatever you think is right. And that's what makes it your paint job. And there's our finished Noir Detective, a fun little project. This was an interesting take for me, practicing highlighting without using colors, and I think it would also work very well with you if you're having problems with your contrast or simply with highlighting or shading and colors are getting in the way. Try painting a miniature with just black and white and see what happens. You may understand the painting process better once you eliminate the colors. So that's all I got for now. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.